I just need you to know that this is very important, what we're fighting for. Because I'm tired, I'm really, really tired of the manipulation. I'm tired of how the press is manipulating everything that's been happening in this situation. They do not tell the truth, they're liars. And they manipulate our history books. The history books are not true. It's a lie. The history books are lying. You need to know that. You must know that. All the forms of popular music, from jazz to hip-hop to bebop to soul, you know, to you talk about the different dances, from the cakewalk to the jitterbug to the Charleston to breakdance. Overnight, they call me a freak. They call me a homosexual. They call me a child molester. They said I tried to bleach my skin. They made everything to turn the public against me. And this was all complete conspiracy. You have to know that. It's time for a change. And let's not leave this building and forget what has been said. Put it into your heart. Put it into your subconscious mind. And let's do something about it.
Ancient traditions describe this in the language of their time. One of the questions that I'm often asked with regard to this material is, if these relationships exist, if they truly exist, why don't we know about them today? Why doesn't Western science understand these principles? Why are we just now discovering them? Well, the answer to that question begins in our understanding that the way we view our world today, our knowledge, is part of a lineage of wisdom that links us with our past. And we know that that link, the link that ties us with those who have come before us, has been broken at least 2 times in recorded history. Twice in recorded history, something happened, an event occurred, and we lost information. And in some instances, it's information pertaining precisely to what we're doing right now. The first one of those breaks was with the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria in the 4th century. While we don't know precisely what was in that library, what we do know is that Roman historians had cataloged volumes and volumes of information. Scrolls is the way that material was written at that time. The Roman historian Callimachos, for example, cataloged over 536,000 scrolls in the Great Library of Alexandria before it was burned, and many of them were very ancient in that time, in the 4th century. And we know that the scrolls contain some of the most ancient documents of the Hebraic, ancient Hebrew traditions, of the Egyptian astronomical traditions and medical traditions, much of the wisdom that had been passed down from thousands of years earlier, describing our relationship to our world, to one another, and perhaps to something even greater. When that library burned, we know we lost tremendous amounts of information then. And the second time was with the edits of the Western biblical texts, the biblical traditions in the 4th century as well, in the year 325 AD. It was during this time in the early Christian traditions when the Emperor Constantine pulled together a council. And at that time there was no biblical text, nice, neat, compiled text the way we see it today. It was a loose assemblage. Many of the texts were redundant. Some of them were poorly written. And very few people were able to access this material. And Constantine, in an effort to make it more accessible to a broad general audience, pulled together a council within the church and said, "Council, make me some recommendations. What should we leave in? What should we take out? How should we arrange this material?" And the result of that was what we call today our Western biblical text, biblical tradition. We know that at least 20 books were completely removed, and another 20 to 25 were tremendously edited, and the remaining texts were condensed and rearranged into what we see today as our biblical text. So as good as our Bible is today, the best biblical scholars will openly and freely admit that it is incomplete. And we know this because we're finding these documents in places like the Dead Sea Scrolls Library. This is why they were so controversial. When we found the Dead Sea Scrolls for the first time, we were able to see many of these books in their original form. Some of them hadn't been seen for 1,700 years. And interestingly, many of the books that were edited or taken out completely are precisely the documents that describe our relationship to the universe and the creation around us through the power of human emotion.
Decades ago, visitors from other planets warned us about where we were headed and offered to help. But instead, we, or at least some of us, interpreted their visits as a threat and decided to shoot first and ask questions after. The inevitable result was that some of our planes were lost, but how many were due to retaliation and how many were as a result of our own stupidity is a moot point. They, the military, must have been and still are so paranoid that they feel it necessary to use the visitors' technology to fight them off, rather than welcome them as partners in development. Stephen has said that talking about UFOs is passé, and that we should be talking or limiting our talk to exopolitics. Well, Stephen, I agree with you in theory, but in reality we have a problem when official U.S. policy insists that UFOs don't exist. The veil of secrecy must be lifted, and it has to be lifted now, before it's too late. It is ironic that the U.S. should be fighting monstrously expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, allegedly to bring democracy to those two countries, when it itself can no longer legitimately claim to be called a democracy, when trillions, and I mean thousands of billions of dollars, have been spent on projects about which both the Congress and the Commander-in-Chief have been kept deliberately in the dark. How much has been accomplished in 60 years of feverish activity by some of the most educated minds in the United States? Has America developed flying saucers that are visually indistinguishable from the visitors, as alleged? And if so, what do they propose to do with them? Even more critical, what progress has been made in the development of clean energy sources that could conceivably replace fossil fuels and save the planet from becoming a veritable wasteland? Well, who has the answers? Someone does, but apparently they aren't telling either secretaries of defense or presidents because they don't have, quote, a need to know. In a story told by Dr. Stephen Greer, President Clinton was asked a question by White House reporter Sarah McClendon about why he didn't do something about disclosure. And Clinton replied, "Sarah, there's a government inside the government, and I don't control it." Excuse me, doesn't the Commander-in-Chief and the person who allegedly has their finger on the nuclear trigger have a right to know what his subordinates are doing? The people of the United States who have paid the bills have the right to know. The people of the world demand to know because it is our descendants too whose lives are in mortal danger. It is time for the people of the United States to launch a new war against the evil of lies, deceit, and darkness, and go all out to win the victory of truth and transparency and light. Thank you.